Welcome in, everyone. Another Friday in the Big Ten here at the Voice of College Football. Appreciate you stopping by. Leave those comments and questions there in the live chat. You know the deal. And it's our another Big Ten live show. It's edition number 64. And as you can see on the banner, we're taking a bit of a deep dive in a few minutes with Tony Altimore stopping by, our consultant strategist, to look at the 4 new entries into the Big Ten and how they match up historically and in terms of brand, culture, academics, everything involved versus the long-standing Big Ten, which includes, of course, the mighty Wisconsin Badgers. We got Ryan Herrings here from Locked On Badgers, and we will find out more about Ryan's work here in just a second, but we want to talk some Wisconsin football, and we knew that Ryan was a great source. So, Ryan, it's great to have you here at the Voice of College Football.
Man, excited to be here. Big fan of everything you've done, and really just humbled to be part of the channel and the show.
And it's great to have you here as well. Hear good things about what's going on there at Locked On. And certainly that's a network that's growing quickly, and I'm sure you're a big part of it. Let's talk some Wisconsin football. Okay, let's go to recruiting. Luke Fickell, different approach than Paul Chryst, through a couple of recruiting cycles. How would you term those differences at this point?
Yeah, that's a great question. Different approach is a great way to lead off with that. This recruiting staff. So I've talked about this a lot. Wisconsin's never going to recruit. I shouldn't say never, but they're going to really struggle recruiting the polished 5-star type athletes, the Ohio State types, the Georgia types, right? So how do you close that gap? What this staff has done is they target length, they target upside, they target athleticism, right? So they've really attacked taller cornerbacks that maybe need a little bit of refinement. They put back-to-back classes at the cornerback spot together really, really well. And they found athletes on the offensive line, defensive line, cornerback, receiver, running back. They're just trying to find upside, and they've revamped with Luke Fickell coming in from Cincinnati. They've really revamped the strength and conditioning program. He's brought his guys with him. He's brought his recruiting guys with him. So they believe if they get the raw tools in, they can develop those guys into the type of players that are going to beat and compete with that upper tier of the Big Ten. So it's really been a change in philosophy of we're going to find guys who maybe need a little bit more refinement. We're going to find guys from places that aren't recruited maybe quite as heavily. We're going to land those guys, and then we believe in-house we can develop them.
So with May and June being what it is in recruiting circles, with all the camps concluding here in the next couple weeks, and of course official visits, how is the progress going for 2025?
Really well. The Badgers are just kind of finishing off a heater, coming off 3 weekends of official visits. And the class is getting pretty full. There's only a couple spots left. They're looking for another defensive lineman probably to fill it in. But aside from that, they've really, really continued to get to that next level in recruiting. Wisconsin at this point, I think they were 12th in the 247 rankings, 5th or 6th in rivals. Now, they have more commits, so that they are going to drop a little bit. But that's indicative of the type of progress they've made. This official visit season has been really, really good. I'll highlight a couple key players. Mason Posa is a 4-star linebacker out of Albuquerque, New Mexico, a guy who had official visits coming up to Oregon, had an official visit coming up to Texas A&M. They were able to get him on campus, and he shut those other visits down. Didn't even get to Oregon or Texas A&M. It's that type of recruiting that they get people on campus now. And Wisconsin traditionally maybe wasn't landing those guys. Now Wisconsin, if they get them on campus, they have a swinging chance to land just about anybody in the country. Another great example of that is Logan Powell, is an offensive lineman coming out of Phoenix. Big time prospect, had a visit coming up to Bama, a few other places. Again, he got on campus. They shut that recruitment down, landed a 4-star guard coming out of Arizona. Just really, really successful with the official visit season. And the Badgers are pretty close to wrapping up that 2025 class.
Do you notice, Ryan, any type of different type of player, especially on the perimeter, because of so much made out of Luke Fickell and Phil Longo and what they want to do with speed and space?
That's a great question. So perimeter, we'll do cornerback and receiver quick. The big difference at cornerback is they're targeting 6'1", 6'2" guys. The last couple classes, a guy that I would highlight in last year's cycle, 2024, was Xavier Lucas coming out of Florida. He's a guy that Miami wanted. He's a 6'1" cornerback with 4.4 speed. They're getting that type of athlete at corner. At receiver, they've really tried to find. They're in on a Muiz Tankara. He's the 6'4" receiver. He's going to be deciding in a couple weeks. And then they were able to land a couple really fast, shifty receivers in the last two classes, Kyan Barry Johnson and Cameron Miller. both kind of explosive playmakers in space that are going to play in that Phil Longo system. Phil Longo famously last year had a quote that said, outside of like my wife and family, slot receivers are my favorite thing on planet Earth, right? And he's been able to find those in the 24 and 25 class to kind of fill out that air raid offense that they're trying to implement.
So Chimere Dike moves on to Florida, so he's gone as a receiver. Will Pauling had a bit of a breakout season last year. So while you just brought it up, I think we'll go there in regards to weapons for this Wisconsin football team. Are they at the position where they are able to put those kind of guys out onto the field, and specifically at slot receiver, since you bring it up?
I think they're probably still a year away, right? I think like Rome, the great saying, Rome wasn't built in a day. Phil Longo, Luke Fickell aren't going to transition an offense and a program that's been pro style for the last 25 years into an air raid in 1 year. But progress was made. Will Pauling, you mentioned, one of the best slot receivers in the Big Ten and the country last year, 74 receptions. He's back. He's a really good player. The receiver a lot of Badger fans are excited about is Tresh Kekahuna. He was a late grab in the 24 class, or 23 class, I apologize. And, he's a guy that has some explosiveness, probably more of a slot guy, but a little bigger than Will Pauling. But on the boundary, I think you're probably still a year away. Bryson Green is a guy that arrived last year out of Oklahoma State. They like what's there, but he had kind of an inconsistent season. CJ Williams was a 5-star receiver coming out of USC. They pulled him in the portal last year. But again, a bit of an inconsistent year. So they're probably a year or two away. But Badger and Bournemouth is a good dude. But they're getting there. And I think it's all progress, right? If you get a little better from last year to this year and a little better from this year to next year, you eventually build that machine that you're trying to get in Madison.
We got Ryan Harrington on the line from Locked On Badgers. What's the best way to lock in with what you've got going on there, Ryan?
No, I really appreciate that. Obviously, we do the YouTube show. That's a daily show. We have a Discord as well. If anyone's interested, we talk. We say no politics, no Gophers. Anything else on the Discord kind of goes. So it's a great way to communicate with the community, or really just join the show, see what's coming up, new guests, that kind of stuff, ask questions. So I would say either YouTube or jump over on the Discord. It's free. No politics, no Gophers. Anything else is good to go.
I think we've got you beat by one here, Ryan, because we're good with the Gophers talk. No politics, but we do allow the Gophers. Sorry about that. There is Minnesota football talk. If I recall, that Wisconsin permanent schedule is announced by the Big Ten starting in 2024 with those permanent opponents. It's Iowa and it's Minnesota, correct?
Correct. Yes, sir.
Does that make sense? Makes sense to me.
Yeah, there's really nothing else on there that would need to be added. You Wisconsin, listen, there's no scenario where you don't not play Minnesota every year. The Axe is enormous. You see it kind of, maybe you can see it on my bookshelf back there or not. I only display it when we win. If the Badgers lose, the Axe goes away until the next year when we play them. So that's the obvious one. And then Wisconsin, Iowa, two programs that have so much similar shared history, both kind of traditionally pro-style guys until just recently. Similar profiles of success as well, just kind of in that tier right below the Ohio States, Penn States, Michigans. You had to keep those. Aside from that, there's no one else in the Big Ten where it feels like Wisconsin has to play them every year. For a long time, Wisconsin, the Big Ten, it felt like they were trying to align Nebraska and Wisconsin as rivals. And it just really hasn't happened. It's felt forced. It feels forced from both fan bases. So, yeah, that the way they did it makes a ton of sense for me.
Ryan, of course, we can't talk about any team without talking about the quarterback position, but especially with the transition that we've got at Wisconsin and with the style of offense that they want to play. Now, if Tyler Van Dyke shows up, and he's the Tyler Van Dyke of about 8 to 9 games in 2021, when he was regularly lighting up defenses in the ACC for 350 yards and 3 or 4 touchdowns every week, including the eventual champion Pitt Panthers, NC State, who had a really good defense. He was just hot, and they had it working there. The last 2 seasons, it's been hit or miss, throwing a few too many to the other team, looking a bit confused, certainly as the arm talent. And go back to the Texas A&M game, folks, and you will see probably the last time when Tyler Van Dyke looked like Tyler Van Dyke and was throwing like NFL type throws over defenders' shoulders, missing helmets by that much because he had that much confidence in where he was going to place the football. But he's a guy that if they get him right, could be pretty incredible. So the 2-part question is the the TVD of evaluation, but also there's a guy by the name of Braden Locke that we can't forget, and his shot at the job.
Yeah, listen, that's the $1 million question. Last year, the Badgers brought in Tanner Mordecai, the SMU transfer, and for a lot of reasons, not all of which were on Tanner Mordecai, it didn't work out, right? The offensive line had some issues. There were some receiver drops. So now you're bringing in another transfer quarterback. Here's the thing with Tyler Van Dyke. I think quarterbacks at times, I don't know if you'd agree with this or not, I think they get too much credit and too much blame for what happens on the field at times. You look at a Miami ecosystem where every year he was switching offensive coordinators. It's just tough as a quarterback when you're constantly being put into new systems. Now, you can easily say, well, he's doing that again, right? Like now he's changing again. But I don't think he was the last couple of years in a system that really suited him. You go back to that 2021 version, that's more what he's going to be asked to run this year. And he gives Wisconsin an arm talent that they frankly haven't had since Russell Wilson. Like that type of ability to vertically push the ball. That's what Tyler Van Dyke does. He is an NFL arm. He is NFL size. Decision-making, consistency, those are question marks. And that's why he's still in college, right? Because if he didn't have those, he'd be in the NFL with those physical tools. But he gives them an upside at that position that they haven't had in a while. And I think that's what's exciting for Badger fans, because if he can hit 80 to 90% of that upside, now you have a veteran offensive line. You have more weapons on the outside that are year two in the system. You have Will Pauling. You have Ches Malusi, Tyree Walker, transfer running back from Oklahoma. Pretty quickly, all the pieces coalesce around that quarterback if Tyler Van Dyke can be a version of that 2021 self. For Braden Locke, he's a guy, came in last year, had to replace Tanner Mordecai, and he had to play Ohio State. He had to play the first game he played was Iowa, right? Like he got thrown into the fire, and I actually thought he acquitted himself pretty well. Really, really smart player, understands what Phil Longo wants. The Badgers have his younger brother, Landon Locke, coming in the 2025 class. So it's kind of a quarterback pipeline there. I definitely wouldn't write him off, but Tyler Van Dyke's going to be the guy until we see what version of Tyler Van Dyke we get. If we get the 21 version, he's going to be the guy the entire year. If we get the inconsistent version, 3, 4, 5 games in, you might see that pivot to Braden Locke.
It's pretty incredible what Braylon Allen was able to accomplish as one of the youngest players in college football. He was basically mashing defenses for 150 yards a week, and he was still 17 years old. So he may not even be 20 years old at this point. I don't know, playing NFL defenses, but he's off and running to the NFL. You mentioned Ches Malusi, extremely talented back coming in from Clemson. He just needs to be able to stay healthy and stay on the field. And Tyree Walker, despite other players at that position being more highly touted, was probably the most dependable back that they've had here in the last year or two at Oklahoma. So it looks like they've got a nice combination there.
Yeah, you said it. Ches Malusi's a super easy guy to root for, right? He's had basically just career-ending injury after career-ending injury, but injuries that aren't related, right? He's not consistently hurting his ankle. He's not consistently pulling a hamstring, a groin, those type of things that make you think it's going to keep happening. It's flukish stuff. It's a broken collarbone. It's getting rolled up and having a leg injury. When healthy, he's really good. He's a B-tier type starting running back. So he's not in that, anything of the great Wisconsin running backs. He's not in that tier, but he's a really good starting running back. And then you have Tyree Walker coming over from Oklahoma, talking to an Oklahoma guy. He said, you guys are going to love him. 7 touchdowns, bowling ball, really runs hard, physical guy. And then behind him, there's 2 freshmen to keep an eye on. There's Dylan Jones and Darian Dupree, both 4-star type running backs, came in last year's class. Alabama tried to poach those guys. Really talented young players. I expect probably Dylan Jones to start working into that reps this year and give the Badgers some version of kind of a 3-headed monster there.
Our guy Sonny from the Illini cast and Locked On Illini gives us great recommendations here at the Voice of College Football on a regular basis. So the last and most recent being, you see him right here, Ryan Herrings from Locked On Badgers joining us. So we appreciate Ryan stepping by and appreciate Sonny as well. So this Wisconsin defense under Jim Leonard was exceptional year after year after year after year, especially in the front 7, posting top 5 defenses in the country on a fairly regular basis. I was always amazed trying to translate the star rankings to the product on the field. They were decent on defense, but nowhere close that standard. With Mike Tressel running the show, is there hope that they can get back to that level?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think one of the aspects that they ran into last year, and this just isn't Tressel. This is Fickle, Coach Longo on offense, Tressel on defense. They were really trying to walk this line of using pieces recruited to a different system. The system Jim Leonard and that staff wanted to run, definitely different than what Tressel ran at Michigan State, Cincinnati. So they were trying to kind of fit square pegs a little bit into round holes. But there were also some talent issues on the front seven. They hadn't adequately replaced some of those linebackers and some of those defensive linemen. So, atypically the Badgers got ran on a little bit last year. Atypically, they didn't have that disruptive outside linebacker that for the last 10 years, it feels like the TJ Watts and the Van Ginkels and the Zach Bonds, they just didn't have that guy. So there was a combination of new scheme, fitting old players into new scheme that didn't fully work, and a combination of lack of talent in the front seven. It should be better this year. They've made a concerted effort. In fact, if you point to one thing in the portal, they went after speed and athleticism at the linebacker spot. They brought in Leon Lowry, a starter from Syracuse, who's going to add some edge burst. John Pius, a starter down in Division II, who's really, really good off the edge. They went and got Tackett Curtis from USC, one of the bigger portal wins. And then they went and got Shaheem Thomas, Arkansas's leading tackler in the SEC. Right. So they really said, we need to revamp this linebacker group. And I think they did. I think they knocked that out of the park. You're going to see more speed, more athleticism, more depth, more versatility, kind of in that middle level of the defense for the Badgers, which is going to generate more of that pressure, more of that disruption. I think the problem and the question you still have is that defensive line. I think they're a year or two away from fully rebuilding that. It's a spot where I think they have guys that are good, they're solid. I don't think they have a disruptive presence there. And as you know, if the defensive line gets pushed around a little bit, then all that speed and athleticism at linebacker, it kind of gets negated a little bit. So that's the big question going into this year for the defense. Linebacker is going to be much, much better. They're deeper, faster, more experienced, more skilled. The secondary is pretty rock solid. Hunter Wohler is one of the best safeties in the country. Ricardo Holman at corner had 7 picks last year. They're both back. But it's the defensive line that's really going to dictate just how good this unit can be. And I think they're probably still a year or two away there.
Folks, it's our Big Ten doubleheader here at the Voice of College Football every Friday. So we hit you up with the Big Ten live show. You can give me a call. Typically, we've got a bit of a different setup tonight with Tony Altimore standing by to do a deep dive on USC, UCLA, Washington, and Oregon. Tons of metrics and analytics to present to all of you. And then we've got our guys, Matt and Tim, standing by 10 p.m. Eastern, 7 Pacific with the USC call-in show over on the USC channel. We got Ryan Herrings right here from Locked On Badgers. And so with the 4 new entries that we're going to discuss here in just a few minutes with Tony, does that shake up the Badger fan base? Do they care? Is there a particular team that they hate, that they like, that they are paying attention to? How does this strike you?
I think they care. I think Badger fans are excited. Like this year, we're going to get USC. We're going to get Oregon. Oregon at home, USC on the road. I don't think Badger fans particularly dislike any of them. There is some recent bad blood with Oregon knocking us off in a Rose Bowl that we felt like we probably should have won. All fans feel like they should have won the games. Certainly history with UCLA in Rose Bowls. So that part of it's kind of interesting. No real rivalries there, but I think Badger fans ultimately feel really good about obviously the conference, right? You feel good about being in the cool kids table in the gymnasium, and that's kind of what the Big Ten or the SEC is. And I think we're mostly just excited. Generally, Badger fans right now also feel really stoked about what Luke Fickell's doing kind of behind the scenes, revamping the recruiting department, revamping the strength and conditioning department. I think there's an element of bring it on. Like a lot of people have kind of anointed some of the Pac-12, former Pac-12 schools coming in. I think there's an element of fan bases from the Iowas, the Wisconsins, the Michigan States. They're kind of like, okay, we're excited for it. We're not dismissing it. Certainly those are great programs, but bring it on. There's a different level of physicality in the Big Ten. And I think Badger fans are mostly just really excited to see how some of those rivalries and some of those matchups play out on the field.
Ryan, it was a good time. We appreciate you stopping by and delivering a breakdown on the Badgers. Again, you are welcome anytime. Love the talk on Wisconsin football, and maybe we'll have you back here soon because we got Big Ten Media Days about a month or so away. Then we'll roll right into August camp and want to hear about those position battles.
Absolutely appreciate it. Anytime you want to talk Badgers, I would love to jump on.
Ryan, thanks for being here. You have a good night.
Thank you.
Again, Ryan Herring's joining us from Locked On Badgers. Please join him right there. You can hear the obvious enthusiasm, the obvious knowledge of Wisconsin football as we continue here on the Big Ten Live Show. And we are ready to roll with Tony Altimore, of course, and the Big Ten deep dive that we are taking tonight with USC, UCLA, Washington, and Oregon. I can't wait to see this one, Tony. This should be an interesting one. And beyond the analytics, the metrics, everything that Tony presents, keep in mind, if you've seen us deliver these in the past, the wealth of knowledge that Tony brings historically and to the current times regarding these athletic programs and everything involved across the landscape of these institutions is remarkable. So we appreciate Tony being here. Tony, it's good to see you. We're ready to talk some Big Ten.
Sorry, I was muted. I was going to say, I am but a mere nobody in the presence of the voice of college football. So.
Well, when it comes to what you present, and I got to tell you again, that's why I'm underlining the historic aspect of this, because beyond the metrics, once we get into some of the agreements, some of the history involving how these conferences came to be, you are at the top of the list in regards to your historic knowledge of all of that.
They all have their own little wacky dramatic stories, that's for sure.
Yes, and they are intriguing. I love to hear them. And John D'Adamo made the comment just here in the last couple of days as I was promoting this show. He said, hey, we all learn something from Tony each and every time he shows up. So we are expecting more of the same tonight. So Tony, appreciate you, and you have the stage, sir.
Oh, thank you. I'm a little bit sick tonight, so I'm sorry if I sound like I have a cold.
Well, Tony, you know, first and foremost, that anytime you need to cancel because you're not.
I know. We had to reschedule for Wednesday, so I was come hell or high water. I was not going to miss the Big Ten Live show tonight.
Okay.
All right. I put the share screen up. So we've been doing these deep dives for about the last year, where we go back and look at a whole bunch of different ranges of information about a school, and we do that for a couple of reasons. One, because it's interesting to learn about them, especially like tonight. We're going to focus on the 4 new teams joining the Big Ten. But there's a bigger picture to it as well. And the reason that we do this is we do them with Mark's, what we call the Voice of College Football universe. Oh, and I didn't fix that from last time. We had a whole slide mess today, so I had to quickly fix some things. So we take a look at all of Mark's channels that are all the Voice of College Football channels. And then we've added in UCLA, Washington, and North Carolina for this kind of batch of them. And what's interesting is this means that everything we look at, we're only looking at in terms of this group of Mark's blue blood schools that he and his fans focus on. So as a result, your academic stuff isn't skewed by Vanderbilt, and all the little schools that sort of mess things up when you compare statistics together. You sort of look like it's all outliers. Well, what we've done here is we've taken just the outliers, we've put them together. And we've done that across a couple different dimensions. So we're going to look at the athletic department, its success, football, budget, basketball, Olympic sports. But we're also going to look at the school itself and the school's success and the school's resources and the school's scale. And we do that because right now there's a huge change going on. And the schools that have resources are in a position to succeed. And the schools that don't have as many resources are not in as good a position to succeed. And it's going to be harder for them. I don't know if you guys heard today, they just put a piece out about how much enrollment has declined across all schools in the U.S., focusing on the 2-year colleges today, with the upcoming demographic cliff that's going to just cripple some of these schools over the next 2 or 3 years. It's going to really matter how financially stable the schools are. So we're going to look at that tonight. Because we could start with, you guys know football. We could start off, we could look at Wikipedia composites and their different factors. We could look at national championships. A lot of you guys out there could name these numbers off the top of your head. A lot of you know the TV numbers. Don't worry, we'll get back to these. And you all know the attendance, so you can make fun of your rivals. So we will get back to those, but we're going to first start with the basics and look at who these schools are. And this is both the 4 new ones as well as the broader Voice of College Football universe. So when we look at these guys all together, there's one thing that's really, really remarkable. And that is that there's the highest degree of what's called a Carnegie classification that a school can get. It's called R1. It means it's like, I don't know, highest level of research activity, I think is what it stands for. Every single one of these schools is R1. Most of these schools are AAU members. A lot of them are state flagship schools, land grant schools. Every single one of them hits the definition of national university for U.S. News. So these are really outstanding institutions, all of them. What is there, 24 in here now, that we compare against. So one of the things to really take away when we look at numbers today, they're only on a scale of these schools. So if somebody's at the bottom, they're still outstanding. It's just, they're at the bottom of this list. All right, let's start with the school. Start with ranks. So the U.S. News rank, a lot of people hate it, has a lot of flaws. They've been trying to fix some of those flaws. They came out with a new formula last year to try to fix a lot of the flack that they got for, encouraging a lot of like the sort of bad behavior, like getting students in too much debt and stuff like that. So they did that, and here are the latest. And check out where the 4 new Big Ten teams fit. UCLA, our arch nemesis, number 1 in this whole group. Followed by Notre Dame, Michigan, Carolina, USC, Florida, Texas, Washington, then Oregon a little bit later. So the Big Ten added some pretty good stuff. And that, by the way, that holds up if we take a look at, the school rank, the sort of the big international one that everybody uses. And when you look at grad schools, you still see the same thing. You got, and by the way, USC is always the red bar, UCLA is always the blue bar, Washington's always the purple bar. Like I said, we had a little tech glitch, and so our little logos disappeared. Look at law school, pretty similar, and med schools, pretty similar there too. Although Oregon, in fairness, their med school is now a separate school. So it's kind of interesting to see, like you guys know the Big Ten. The joke is the B in Big Ten stands for billions, and they're talking about the schools. And you'll see tonight, like the Big Ten made some pretty hefty additions with the new schools. So let's look at costs. What does it cost to go to these schools? Well, this is the one place it's not very flattering. So here's the average net price that a student with any kind of federal financial aid gets. Then the next line is the in-state full price, and then the next line is the full out-of-state price. Of course, USC is private, so there's no in-state price. And you see that even in-state, they are not cheap. USC is what, 85 now?
Mm-hmm.
Ridiculous. So they are not cheap. But who gets in? Well, I think this is interesting. This is applicant popularity. So one of the many measures you can look at. How many people applied to go to that school? How many people wrote an essay or whatever and said, I want to go to that school? UCLA is the number 1 most applied to school in the nation.
Huh.
Above everybody. So
do you have a theory as to why?
It's a great school. It's in LA. It is really cheap if you live in state. There's also something to do with like when you do one application like to the University of California, it's easier to do them between them. People from like their non-California rivals get really mad at it, but it's like 150,000 kids apply to go to your school. You look down the list, by the way, the UCLA is 150. A lot of these schools that are bigger than UCLA have like, 22,000.
Yeah.
18,000.
You've got a 64,000 disparity between UCLA and number 2 Penn State, and you've got about that same disparity between Penn State and the rest of the list.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's pretty ridiculous. Now, Penn State's always a little screwy too, because they went through a period of trying to pretend they were one school and combining all their numbers. So if you're not careful, like when you look at Penn State, like how many athletes did they have? It looks like they picked up like 1,800 spare ones for 2 years. So I always try to correct data, by the way. And so any of you guys that ever know weirdness in the numbers, just let me know if there's ever anything weird, because it's, you don't always know. Other than Penn State did not randomly pick up 1,800 athletes in 1 year. Looking at admissions rate, UCLA has the hardest admissions rate of everybody. And there's another number that's also really interesting. We'll talk about why this matters in just a sec. But yield rate. So the two numbers always look at when you want to think about like how good is the school admissions wise. There's two numbers because the schools can mess with one, but if you mess with one, you can't really mess with the other. And those are admissions rate and yield rate. So admissions rate is how many of your applicants were admitted into the school. And then yield rate is what percentage of the kids that you gained offers to chose to attend. And there's some, by the way, there's some schools with some crazy yield rates. Like Gallaudet in DC has a huge yield rate. BYU has a huge yield rate. The academies. But for UCLA to be a public school at 50% is pretty crazy.
Just to let you know, Tony, I've invited some reps from Washington and UCLA and Oregon. We'll see if they show up. We got Tony Siracusa from UCLA, of course.
A page that he will like right here.
An acclaimed alum here with last word on college football. So, Tony, thank you for being here.
Hey, gentlemen, how are you this evening?
Doing great.
Good.
Thank you.
We're digging into the Bruins right here. I'm gonna have to take a shower after this, but we have some pretty nice numbers coming for UCLA.
Right. Look, it's what, tied for first among public schools in the U.S. News and World Report, right up there with Cal. I think 15 overall, and number one among the public schools, and
number one in applications among everyone.
Right. Yeah, they get over 100,000 applications a year annually now, and it's become routine. It's obviously a high-rated university.
You can brag now, Tony. We'll eventually get to the football.
It's true.
That's a whole different story.
And what this chart does here is it takes those two numbers and puts them together on the same chart. So it looks at your yield rate and your admit rate.
Right.
And again, you see, again, all of these are great schools. You see, number one is and the way you sort of measure with this chart was Notre Dame. Because of course Notre Dame has that really high yield rate of kids that apply there really want to go there.
Sure.
All right, let's look at your students. So enrollment really matters because I don't know how many of you guys know about the demographic cliff that are watching, but it's a huge crisis that's about to devastate a lot of colleges. Basically, U.S. birth rate has been going down. There's a lot fewer people of young age in school right now than there used to be. And then at the same time, schools who've been getting greedy have been trying to get bigger. Michael Crow's got 120,000 between the live and the virtual at Arizona State. And so as a result, there's more and more pressure on the bottom to come up with students. And that's about to blow up in about, a year and a half, 2 years, when essentially in the 2008 recession, when the economy blew up, a lot of people put off having kids. So those kids who weren't born, therefore, aren't going to school next year when they're supposed to. And it's going to take that, the already declining birth rate and just punch it in the face. So a lot of D3 schools are scrambling on how to get people.
You're actually seeing several D3 schools start to shut down.
Yeah, but
they just can't hang in there anymore.
Another one in Philly gave up a week ago, I think.
Yep.
Sad. So anyway, so enrollment matters because one of the other thing that enrollment does, it gives you cushion, it gives you resources. If you've got a lot of students, you've got a lot of money. It gives you the option to have resources because you can also be like UCLA and have the resources and just not always use them. But it gives you the option of just a sort of a base of stability that really helps a lot. So this is interesting too. We were talking about, remember how we said, over the last decade, a lot of schools have been losing students. Look at these schools. Oregon's they've gotten bigger in undergrad, but a little smaller in grad students. But the other three are just growing like gangbusters. And so your question is, you go ahead.
No, go ahead. I didn't want to interrupt you. Go ahead.
Oh no, I was just gonna say that the question is, will they, when push comes to shove, for some of them, now these schools, USC, UCLA, and Washington are both sort of have such high demand, I think they'll be fine. But for a lot of the other schools, the question will be, do we want to, for some schools, they'll start to wonder, do we want to have fewer kids or do we want to open our admissions a little more? Because Is the further you go down the chain, the more schools will have to be flexible, as there aren't as many young people as there have been traditionally.
I think also when you look at some of these campuses, location matters, and you get to something like and it's not something you can necessarily quantify to put on one of your tremendous charts. And by the way, your charts are tremendous.
Oh, thank you. Just PowerPoint.
Still, I mean, every time you put stuff out on social media, man, I'm blowing it up and printing it and looking at it in every angle. And
if you ever need another cut, just let me know anytime.
I appreciate it.
We can always run data for you.
And I'm sorry if you guys hear a little bit of chaos, but we actually have 2 new 12-week-old kittens that came to live with us this week. So there's a little bit of chaos in the house. They haven't yet gotten used to, hey, when I'm on air, be quiet over there. They got some training to go through. But you talk about something like UCLA, and there's a little bit of a hard cap that isn't really a known number. It's not based on numbers. It's based on space. It's based on availability. The school is buffered by Beverly Hills and Brentwood and Bel Air and so on. There's nowhere to grow. They actually bought a piece of property that used to be a shopping mall. It used to be the West Side Pavilion. Yeah. And
the whole office now.
Exactly. It's like, 3 miles off campus. And because they needed more office space, it's not even viable for classroom space. They bought another piece of property down in, I want to say, Palos Verdes, in that area, just because you have to keep the students there on campus. You can't be putting them in 4 different locations. That's not viable.
No, then you start to sound like internal accounting and accounts payable and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, you move the stuff that can be remote. But you are at a point where you don't have a lot of room. Same thing with USC. It's, where are you going to move? It's,
well, the other challenge,
you're not going to bulldoze the Coliseum next door to give yourself more space.
Well, the other challenge is what you move when you want to build something, particularly for sports. The question is, what do you move? Now, there's a whole mentality in college architecture called the Oregon experiment, I think. It's the whole idea of that they don't do centralized planning because they want the campus to sort of grow naturally over the years as it should, which is exactly the type of thing you'd say if you had a little campus carved into the giant woods in the middle of nowhere, Oregon. But for USC and UCLA, for example, like when USC would put up a new building, it would involve like 4 different office moves over like a year and a half just to be able to get everybody off the space to make room for it. Because you'd have to build some temporary space, move somebody in there, move somebody into the space they were in before, move somebody in the space they were in before. Now you can knock down the building and put up a tennis court or whatever you're going to put up.
Look, you look at UCLA. I've traveled enough throughout the old Pac-12 and other parts of the country, and certainly through the ACC, and you see some beautiful college baseball stadiums. UCLA, even with its College World Series championship, is playing at Jackie Robinson Stadium, which is on the grounds of the Veterans Administration, where there's the VA hospital and frankly the cemetery right over there. And there is a baseball stadium that is meager by even generous proportions. I mean, in terms of seating and whatever, there's no room to grow. They can't build a nice baseball complex because there's nowhere to put it. And it was 4 or 5 years ago, maybe, that the VA talked about kicking UCLA out of that area because they needed more space. And UCLA would have been left with no baseball stadium.
Well, I mean, USC didn't have a baseball stadium this year.
Right.
So here's another interesting thing. So we were talking about the resources that the school has and the differences that makes. So this is total budget and core budget. Now, these are 2 numbers that people get mixed up a lot. So I'll tell you guys what they are so you guys know when you're listening, everybody out there. Core budget is the cost of running the school as a school. So all the regular things that go into being a university. are the core budget. The total budget adds like extra things. So, and sometimes they're very important, big things like a giant healthcare system or a huge federal nuclear research lab, or things like that are part of the school, but outside the regular sort of doing of school. So this chart here shows you the core budgets and the total budgets of the 4 schools, again, compared to the Voice of College Football universe there. And you see UCLA with phenomenal UCLA Medical Center is number 1. And there's a reason that UCLA went, and you see right next to USC is Miami, who's been ascended recently, particularly in medical stuff. And there's a reason the new UCLA chancellor is the Miami president.
Right.
And it's because they were going to go get a president who knew how to run a healthcare center first and foremost, and then was pretty good at sports on the way as well. So
no,
congratulations.
I think that's I think that's a good point. And when you look at some of these schools, it's interesting to dig deeper and find out what those other sources of revenue are. In other words, like you mentioned, Miami healthcare, UCLA, obviously the Ronald Reagan Hospital and the Mattel Children's Hospital and Jules Stein Eye Clinic, a medical school that takes up half of the campus. So it's interesting to look at some of these and say, what is it that is bringing in that non-core revenue that kind of,
it's usually
is a
medical. Texas A&M has some like Department of Energy labs, I think, in there.
Mm-hmm. Right.
One thing about Oregon, guys, when you look at the Oregon numbers, let's be fair to the Ducks. We like to tease the Ducks. Let's be fair to the Ducks right now. I think it was in the 70s or maybe the 80s. I think it was the late 70s or something. I could be wrong. The state of Oregon did a reorganization, and they took away Oregon's med school and gave it to a new school they created called OHSU, like the Oregon Health and Sciences University.
That's it.
So, if you talk to older doctors, they went to the University of Oregon Med School. But today it's OHSU. Georgia did the same thing. It's called Augusta today. So we do give Oregon a caveat that, Oregon's over there without a med school. So is Alabama because it's UAB, and they're both sort of in the same scoop of like, it's really kind of maybe theirs, or at least it used to be.
It's interesting too, when you look at some of the schools, there's the obvious, like you talked about, the Department of Energy, utilizing part of Texas A&M and things like that. But how much it impacts the school with regards to the administration of that university, right? USC has undergone a lot of administrative turmoil and chaos over the last 10 years. UCLA, like you mentioned just a few minutes ago, in the process of changing, the top as Chancellor Block retires about 5 years too late. So, but you look at some of the schools that have the more stable administration, and you compare those to the ones where it's going to be these revenue factors regardless of who's sitting on top. It's just a matter of how well the person sitting on top manages the system and doesn't get in the way, really.
Yeah, that's also true. Sometimes you just need to let the machine roll itself a little bit with some of these schools.
Exactly. Yeah.
Another thing I think is interesting is looking at, we talk a lot about public schools. This is, of course, only public schools, but this is how much government funding they actually get from the state. So, what's the appropriated money they get from the state? And I think for a lot of these schools, it's a whole lot less than you'd think. So, for example, you take a look at Michigan, and only 3.3% of Michigan's budget comes from the government, from the state government. So a lot of the public schools that people think are getting a ton of money from the government really aren't. I mean, Michigan is functionally like a private school. They get 3% of their budget from the government. Now, the truth is everybody gets a ton of their money from the federal government in terms of research grants and, student aid. But when we think about just pure, traditional appropriations, I think a lot of people would be really surprised at how small these numbers are. So the left one shows how many actual dollars, and then it's percent of core budget and percent of total budget, that's coming from the state. So for UCLA, they're only getting 6%. Washington's only getting 7%. Oregon's only getting 8%. I mean, the entire University of Oregon only gets $86 million from the state. So it's which is part of why their gravy train is, what are they? I think they're 30% California students.
Yeah, I think that sounds right.
At USC, they call it Cal State Eugene. But no, it's one of the things. I mean, they're only pulling $86 million from the state. So when you think about it, like it's really impressive what they do, and those out-of-state students help. So tuition revenue. This is another interesting metric. So we talked about how the fiscal or the demographic cliff is going to cause fiscal problems for a lot of these schools. So one of the interesting metrics too is to take a look at how much do you depend on tuition revenue for your budget. The more you depend on tuition, the more you've got to make sure those seats are full of students. Well, you see here, actually, what's pretty wild is, these are all great schools here in Mark's Boys College Football universe. And you see nobody is over, 50%, 51% of core budget. No, somebody is. Penn State's a little bit over. But in general, these schools have a really, really wide, diverse base of funding. And that matters a ton. One of the big places that comes from is research. Because one of the things, like we talked about, the more resources you have from different sources coming in, the more stable your school is, and the more they can weather something like a buyout when they need to, or whatever else is to come right now in the crazy world of college sports. So having that stuff matters. And one of the big gravy trains for the school is research, because when you get a research grant, the school gets a big chunk of that for overhead, which they just keep. So the school is pulling an enormous amount of this, I forget what the number is percentage wise, but it's usually an overly high generous percentage of the research grant goes to the school. So when you take a look at it here, this is what's pretty amazing. I mean, a lot of these schools, you hear schools all the time like bragging about, oh, we did $30 million of research this year. Oh, we did $80 million of research this year. These schools, particularly in Mark's universe and especially in the Big Ten, are insane. Washington did almost 1.6 billion. UCLA did over 1.5 billion. USC broke $1 billion. Then, of course, Oregon, no med school, and Oregon State does all the sciences stuff, so they only had 161 million. But there's a lot of schools that 161 million would be insane to, versus here you can barely see the bar. So one of the amazing things about the Big Ten is really the strength of the schools. And again, you see that right here. If only we could just get more of those kids from the lab to go to the game, then we'd be all set. Endowment is another one. So for any of you guys that don't know, an endowment is sort of like a school's trust fund, like a savings account that the school lives off the interest of every year to a certain extent. So this is looking at, and by the way, guys, what we've done here to try to give you the most accurate portrayal, you'll see there's lots of little footnotes and stuff. I've tried to combine the best of the different studies, because different people measure things in different ways. And so, if somebody's wacky in one area, I try to pull their number from the other so that we're giving you sort of the best holistic picture. So this combines a look at and it does actually, we did a special fix for UC here because they don't report it all to the Department of Ed. So we fixed that for them. But you see here how much endowment is really held for UCLA. USC is at $7.5 billion. UCLA is at $7 billion. They'll tell you it's less. It's not. Oregon's at $1.5 billion. And having big endowment resources, again, just means the school has a guaranteed flow of income that it doesn't have to ask for anybody for, doesn't have to teach anybody for, it just comes in. Check every year. Stanford, for example, we'll get to this with athletic endowments. Oh, it's next right here. So a lot of these schools are really trying to push now starting athletic endowments or putting more money into theirs. Stanford's is ridiculous. Stanford took $38 million of their athletic budget last year came from the interest off the athletic endowment. So that means that they have $38 million of bonus money that every year that everybody else doesn't have.
The thing with Stanford also is, the math is not difficult to get to know why Stanford has more NCAA championships than anyone else.
No, it is not.
They're competing in sports that half the time I didn't realize even gave NCAA championship trophies. They have 7 sports that aren't even budgeted out of the athletic department. They come strictly from endowment. So you got 7 teams out there that you're fielding that the athletic department doesn't even have to pay for. And you start to see when you do the things we do, and certainly I know Lars has seen this also, that when you get the press releases from the school about a basketball coach or a baseball coach, it comes with their full title, right? It's the Mark Rogers, endowment baseball coach at Ohio State. You know what I'm saying? It comes.
Oh.
We don't refer to them as that. It's just, hey, it's the baseball coach, but someone is paying for their seat. Mick Cronin has that at UCLA. It's becoming more and more common as a way to help offset the salaries of some of these coaches.
Well, and at Stanford, they actually give them corporate titles too.
Right.
So they're like the senior director of, outside receivers.
Right.
Outside receiver operations. It's kind of funny. Like they give them crazy titles. But this just sort of shows that athletic endowments are growing. And I think it's going to be a bigger source of push for schools because, again, it just sort of gives them stability. Every time you can have another big revenue source, it makes it a little bit easier. We're going to talk about subsidies in a minute, but you guys have been hearing me say for a while, you guys who follow the channel have been hearing me say for a while about the problems Houston has. Well, Houston decided they're all done with their problems because they fired their AD yesterday because he couldn't get the revenue up. And subsidies were killing him. Houston subsidizing $40 million a year out of academic money into the athletic department. It's not sustainable. So one of the big places that money does come from is donors. So this is old because I don't have the new data. So this ends in FY20. So take it with a grain of slack. But this shows school-wide fundraising. So it's five-year average FY16 to 20. How much did the school bring in on average every year? Every year in donations from alumni, donors, foundations, etc. And in this, if you see the darker piece of line, it's because they have a huge offsite component. They got a lot of money for a few of them. But again, you see it's pretty wild. Of the top 4 in Mark's universe, really the top 3 are all USC, Washington, UCLA. And then, of course, Texas has like those 4 giant med schools that are sitting off campus. So
I don't have anything to prove this. It's just purely anecdotal, but I'd also be willing to bet if
David Geffen helps that.
Right. If you were to look at Texas, the donations are coming off fewer than 24 people. The vast majority of them.
I believe it.
It's
true anyway.
If you look at UCLA's fundraising, it's coming in much smaller denominations from a larger group of people. UCLA's large scale donors have a dozen of them, maybe. The rest of it is 1,000 here, 5,000 there out of whatever random people are sending checks in,
and then $1 billion from Geffen.
Well, sure, yeah, he's got because he's got buildings on campus named after him.
Every now and then another $1 billion puts a finger on the scale of your averages.
Sure.
And then looking at market, one of the things that's interesting is, of course, USC and UCLA together in the same city. They are definitely in the largest city of any of these major football schools and in the biggest state of any of these football schools. So this takes a look at how many people are within a 50-mile radius. Please don't argue with me, guys. I promise it's from the census. Don't argue. They'll be like, no, there's 4.82, not 4.1. People get grouchy, but so it's FY22 is what these numbers are from. But it sort of gives you a sense that there are a lot of people around those 2 schools particularly. And then it goes Michigan, Washington. So, one of the things you really see here is these 3 new schools are really sort of putting this on a lot of these various institutional metrics are really sort of, putting their finger on the scale. So this is a really interesting thing. So I just pulled the Google Trends numbers. You can Google Trends, you can argue with it or not. I don't usually like to use it, but I thought it would be just something interesting and easy. And I took a look at, size of the state. So going sideways is how big your state is. And going up and down is your Google Trends score for college football. And then, of course, the dots are each states. They're not schools, it's states. And it's kind of interesting. You see California where it is and Alabama where it is.
Everyone in the state of Alabama Googling Alabama and Auburn football about 47 times a day.
Right.
Exactly. Sure. I thought that was just kind of a fun, interesting little look.
Not a shocker.
For the athletic department, so here's how many official varsity sports they run. Now, guys, again, there's going to be angry people in the comments. No need to be angry in the comments. This is the actual official number. Whether like uphill, indoor, underwater, basket weaving, cross country is different from like above water cross. Like we don't. A lot of them sort of split sports up in a lot of different ways. But this is how many they had last year that they reported to the federal government as how many official sports they have. And, a lot of these schools, some of the schools that have a ton, are like, Ohio State and Stanford. Ohio State's number one in here, number one in the Big Ten. I mean, Ohio State's got a synchronized swimming team. They've got all kinds of stuff. A lot of these schools have rifle teams. Those, there's no room at USC and UCLA or Washington for a lot of those things, so they don't do them.
Some of them have bowling teams. I saw that on ESPN once. There was college bowling.
Yeah, Jacksonville State bought themselves a championship.
Yeah, and if I recall, it was Nebraska is also really good at bowling. So who knew?
And I think
to me, bowling was always one of those things that you're better at the more beers you have. But
true.
That's a whole different topic.
Nothing much.
Sorry, Lars.
Yeah, what was
sorry,
that, Lars?
I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh, no, you're good. I was just going to say, I think UW also has beach volleyball, which is hard to believe in Seattle. So I'm not sure if that's an Olympic sport or an actual sport that counts or not. But yeah, there's a bunch that are popping up all across.
Yeah, beach volleyball is really fun. I started watching it whenever it's on, whenever I can catch UFC on TV, and I love it. So this is another interesting thing. This is kind of a ridiculous chart. So this is national championships. Now this is consensus football national championships. No dime store 2017 whatevers, which actually hurts USC a little bit because we have a whole bunch of debatable ones. And then it's also all official NCAA trophies up through last year because we don't have this year's done yet. And then the AIAW, which was the women's sports for the few years before the NCAA started, added together. And it is insane to look at USC and UCLA, and actually Stanford is up there too. But look at you in this chart, look at USC and UCLA compared to everybody else.
Wow.
Well, and then, correct me if I'm wrong, Stanford is number one in most NCAA championships. If you combine Stanford, UCLA, and USC, they have, the three of them combined have more than pretty much any other conference as a whole.
Yeah, no, they do. It's wild when you take a look at it. And then to the right is individual championships. I did think it's interesting that UCLA didn't have as many of those as I thought, but maybe because they don't have swim, stuff like that. So then this is looking at overall success here with the Directors Cup. So we look on the right is last year's points, and then to the left is the last 5 non-COVID years added together. And it's kind of funny that in this grouping of these schools, you see the pairs. You've got USC and UCLA right next to each other, and Washington and Oregon right next to each other.
Ohio State and Michigan right next to each
other.
Right
next to each other. It is kind of funny. Yeah, it's we always laugh that sometimes USC and UCLA are a little more like partners in crime than deep hatred. But what about varsity athletes? So this kind of looks at how many varsity athletes they have, unduplicated. So if you're on 2 teams, track people have sometimes claim to be on 4 teams. indoor, outdoor, cross country track, whatever. So this actually is looking at unduplicated. And then it tries to take a stab at estimating what percentage of them really could be on full ride scholarship if the school is maxing out its scholarships. A lot of these schools we know are. But it tries to attempt to estimate that, again, rolling them all up because 4 guys on the baseball team might each get a fourth, but that's one. So how many could they actually give? And we try to give a sense right there. Oregon's a little smaller than we think. Miami was a lot smaller than we thought. UCLA is big. They got a lot of kids. And they're winning. So what about the budget? All right, so this is a complicated number because what we tried to do is give you the best numbers we could get, whether a school was private or public. So it's breaking all of the rules of data analysis and pulling from 2 different sources because we can't get private school data from the better source. So this combines the best of what we could get for everybody. But it shows you here athletic budget and then how much revenue did the program generate before any subsidies. So before any school academic subsidy, before any tax on the students as a student fee, or before any of the school picking up losses or debt financing or anything like that. So this tries to take a look again. What's the budget that they spent? How much do they earn, and what's the difference? We don't know, of course, for USC. We do know they reported spending to $212 million. It's a higher number than that. It's probably closer to 250, depending on debt payments for the Coliseum and the new baseball facility they're building and stuff like that. But their operational expense they reported was $212 million. Washington reported 150. Oregon reported 147. UCLA reported 142.
Hey Tony, what years do these numbers cover?
This is FY23.
Okay.
So
UCLA still has the ability to blame Chip Kelly for the empty Rose Bowl and the lack of revenue off football games.
Well, that is the difference right there. I mean, I've done calculation, like rough. I mean, of course, it's hard to roughly calculate. I don't have their internal numbers. Just sort of guesstimating. Sure. Like I think the empty Rose Bowl is what's killing you.
Sure.
Because again, we talk like everything you can do that brings in more money from a different source, it adds up.
Could Auburn's deficit there at 32 million possibly be because they're still paying off 2 coaches that no longer are employed?
Is it only 2?
Well, it's Gus Malzahn and it's Brian Harsin.
Mm-hmm.
So,
that's right. The new guy isn't on that list yet.
Malzahn's number was through the roof too.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. Auburn generally has a lot. I think Auburn plays a lot more. I don't know much about Auburn, so I don't want to speculate. But I think that I've really noticed that they are often a little higher on stuff like that. So let's look at that dreaded subsidies. We got burning money here. So the subsidy is how much is the school having to how much is the school covering of its and the students' money for the athletic department. And one of the things you'll notice here is at most of these schools, it's not that much. It was interesting. I was actually having a conversation with an office in Capitol Hill the other day about the impact of the House settlement and how those numbers look when we think about the idea of, will schools essentially just try to start paying this money and then push the money off onto undergrads who then get another $5,000 or $10,000 worth of debt thanks to paying off the football players. And the senator did not want that to happen. But it's interesting to sort of look at here. A lot of these schools have no subsidy. So Ohio State, Texas, Penn State, Nebraska, LSU, Oklahoma, Michigan, essentially Oregon, Tennessee, Iowa have no subsidy. UCLA has almost no subsidy. They've been covering their losses with debt. Debt from the school, not real debt, like pretend money. And so I guess they're working their budget to pay that back down. Washington had a $10.3 million. Again, Houston had a $40 million subsidy. Coastal Carolina has like a $35 million subsidy when you add it all together. So it's wild to sort of see some of those numbers. Because again, when we think about schools are going to be under a lot of financial pressure, this number is going to matter. Of course, these schools, a lot of them have big full stadiums, so that's not as much of an issue. And then athletic debt. Again, one of the things, guys, for athletic departments borrow money cheap. It's part of why all this private equity thing, I like kind of roll my eyes at a little bit, because schools get money for cheap, right? Like credit risk, the ability to borrow. Schools have better access to borrowing than private equity firms do in a lot of cases for cheaper and better money. So, but the issue is, so when you think about a school that makes a huge investment, like, when USC and Washington recently had to do, their 100-year rebuilds of the stadium, it makes sense to do debt financing on that, right? It makes sense. It'd be stupid not to, because money's cheap. But the catch is you got to make sure that, your school's paying it down and you're not turning into Georgia Tech, who all of a sudden realize it's been so long since they did their stadium last. Oh, crap, we're going to probably have to redo it again. But we actually didn't pay down any of the debt from when we redid it. So they have to pay it down. So you look at some of these schools, Ohio State, I think they did a big renovation. Again, a lot of this is long-term stadium debt. And that's fine as long as you don't get into a situation where, I guess, just like anything in regular life, you don't get into a situation where you have this, an albatross hanging off your neck.
There's with this, because the numbers make a lot of sense, when you start having the conversation about context as to the relationship between the athletic department and the debt, you get into some pretty nuanced conversations as well. I know that because we're focused on the 4 schools going to the Big Ten in comparison to some of these other public schools. You look at what happened at Cal with their stadium renovation that then they couldn't afford. And the school and the school basically paid it off. You look at a lot of these schools, and
they're still number 1 in debt, though, total.
Right.
Even after the school paid half of it.
Which, think about how much trouble they'd be in financially if they didn't. Because as you point out, the schools can get the financing. The schools can do it. An athletic department unto itself generally cannot.
No.
When you look at what happened with UCLA and the $113 million, and that's after they just got their first settlement payment of, I think, what's going to be 4 settlement payments in the Under Armour lawsuit, which helped pay it down because it was up to like 120 at some point. There's a brick wall between the university and the athletic department financially at UCLA. All Gene Block did was offer to give the athletic department a low interest loan. That was the extent of the help that the university was going to give the athletic department.
Martin Jarman's job is like if Melinda Gates had to sell like oranges on the side of the freeway for food.
Right.
That's how I look at it.
Yeah,
but at the same time, Martin Jarman built a plan and he's getting them back there and they're getting it taken care of. So also, go Bruins on that. Because, in some level, me as a sports fan, I like to say your school should be subsidizing. But I also have a lot of respect for the schools who look at it and say, no, the athletic department will pay for itself. So I'll give you guys an example. Kansas State. Kansas State has a total subsidy of $0.
Right.
And that is wild. Like that is out. Like their AD, Gene, does a phenomenal job managing that school because it's hard to do that.
With regards to the UCLA debt and what you said, the university will or won't do for them. That's also why my advice to the athletic department at Cal and Cal fans, I wouldn't sit there by your computer refreshing, looking for that $6 million a year that the Board of Regents thinks UCLA is going to send to you. I wouldn't be waiting for that wire transfer to happen.
No, I'm also curious as to whether they're just gonna whether they're actually gonna do it all out in their accounting, transfer to here, or whether they're just gonna be like, oh, we took care of it at the top end, like they do normally anyway.
I don't think they're gonna pay it. Why would they? The Board of Regents can't actually make them pay it. They actually don't have the authority to enforce that payment. It was a recommendation. If I'm UCLA, I'm like, if I'm UCLA, I'm like, what recommendation? Sorry, we didn't get that memo. You know, whatever. We'll talk about it. We'll get on it.
I love it. So what about athletic revenue? So here's an issue for these schools. Of course, USC not on here because it's private. By the way, guys, there's a couple different places we can get athletic financial data from. I'll tell you the place that you can get it for private schools, it's bogus because it includes all sorts of just random imaginary subsidies that the school essentially just makes up. We won't get into the boring accounting end of how that works, but essentially the schools just make up subsidies and it just goes in there. So I don't use that because it's bogus number, but for the public schools, we can get real revenue data. So this is really the crux of why we're here tonight on Big Ten Live. This is conference payments, media rights, NCAA payments, and postseason football. And who are three of the bottom? Thank you, Larry Scott. But you sort of see why the schools had to make a change. Why Oregon did what would not be considered a logical move in a lot of ways, but they needed to. Here's game day revenue and donor giving combined together, because sometimes depending on how they account for things, sometimes that shows like the stuff that contributes to tickets shows up as don't, like sometimes it's two numbers, sometimes it's closer to one, but I put them both here for you guys on the right and left. But yeah, you see what the empty Rose Bowl did. Like that's a rough number. And of course, Oregon, problem with Oregon is you're capped at Autzen. It's good to be Texas and Michigan and LSU and A&M. What about spending? So this is looking at coaches' pay. So the kind of a complicated line. The gray line is football. The blue is the rest of the men's sports, and then the pink is all of the women's sports.
Why does UCLA have a yellow line?
Because just so that you know it's UCLA.
Oh, I gotcha. All right, makes sense. Yes, Washington has a purple line. Okay, if I had looked, I get it.
Kind of interesting to see. And of course, we don't have USC because it's public schools only.
Right.
No, this is an interesting thing. So there's two elements of this budget. So we'll kind of look at them together in just a sec. But the first one is how much the school admits they spent on each sport. And then there's like an unallocated overhead that the school didn't allocate to the different sports. So this is how much football is of the money they admit they spend on things. How much of the allocated money is spent on football. And you see, UCLA is second lowest on here of everybody. USC is the highest of this group. So USC says they spend 58% of their sports money on football. And then you see men's basketball is the middle gray line, and then all the rest of the sports combined are the top. So it is kind of interesting to see, kind of the difference of these different schools. I thought it was interesting that Miami was number one in football spending as a percentage.
Yeah.
And then this is where it gets real interesting. How much money did they not admit they allocated to the different sports? Now, like guys like John Wildhack at Syracuse, he's a famous ESPN executive who retired and took the Syracuse job, sort of a retirement. He has them down to something like $9 million of unallocated. Like they're doing accounting that it allocates all their money out. So there's a game, there's sort of a question of like, is the school really counting everything? So USC, for example, of that, what was the budget? 250 million or 210 million, whatever it is. USC says like 100 of it is not allocated. So like, that's for everybody. So they're aggregating a ton of costs. So when we look at sports again, if we add the unallocated, now we can get a real number on what they're really spending on football. So what I did to add is I just took it and based it on each athlete. If you say that's what it costs to run the department. But you see it adds a pretty hefty amount onto each sport. So this is looking at what we think a little closer number to what than the official numbers as to what the schools are actually spending on football. So you see, of this whole group right now, USC is number 2 behind Alabama. It's kind of interesting. And then you see UCLA down there with Carolina and Washington, Oregon.
I was going to say, I do want to add really quick just on the Washington. It seems like they're getting a decent bang for their buck in terms of the amount spent and relative success. Now, again, that doesn't across all sports. Obviously, basketball, without question, has underperformed. But football, especially under Caleb Boris, seems like they certainly did well for themselves in the past couple of years.
They did really well for themselves. Yeah, they had and they actually do overall too, across all their different sports. They get some pretty good bang for the buck. So this is basketball. By the way, I realized I'll admit what I did. We were supposed to do the Michigan-Ohio State one the other day, and so I accidentally realized I had recolored all the lines over top of it for Michigan and Ohio State, and thought I'd saved an extra copy that I didn't. So right before we went on air, I was frantically recoloring these lines. So I apologize. I started to run out of time. I got them all done, but they were supposed to have little logos on each one, but that was my bad.
Tony.
Basketball. Now here's baseball.
We're so
Now what's interesting here is look at how much that unallocated money adds to these sports. There's a lot of money that is dubiously not a shady way, right? Just in the way that accounting works. When you see people say, we spend X amount on baseball, are you including it all? Women's basketball, again, now you sort of start to see these teams sort of group into the middle. Women's volleyball, go SC. Now let's look at what we want. Let's look at football. All right, so we gave you guys a sense of the school itself and how the school spends money and what they spend money on. Now let's look at football, what you guys love. So football today. So let's look. Here's last year's football success and then kind of the medium-term football success. So we're looking at here. The left is 2023, last year's SP+. The right is 2002 to 2023. It was 20 years when I started gathering the data in 2022. But it's essentially 2 decades of data versus last year's data. And you see kind of how they stack up. So by the way, SP Plus is not perfect. So Washington, you guys are getting screwed on here. You should be higher. But I mean, to be in where you are is an elite stratosphere. So it's fine. But just acknowledging the dogs out there. I don't like what SP Plus does for you, but if I use a regular ranking, then I can't get beyond 25. So
we did our program rankings a couple months ago for all the conferences, running through 15 to 20 different metrics, and it was pretty incredible how close UCLA and Washington are aligned in various, when you add it all together, all time in terms of conference championships and winning percentage and bowl appearances and bowl wins and NFL players and all these various metrics. It comes out extremely close for those two across the board.
I believe it. They're both great schools.
I was going to say something symbolic about Jim Moore being a former UW player that goes to UCLA and UCLA beating UW in 22 when they absolutely should not have. No offense, Tony. Just that was kind of criminal. That night in the Rose Bowl. I still don't know how they lost that game, but I digress.
I remember it. All right, so let's look at trends here. This is SP Plus success trends. How much better or worse were you last year than your average over those 20 years that we just looked at? So, how many average, points did you go up and down in ranks? Washington was the most improved over its average last year, followed by UCLA among the whole Voice of College Football universe. No, that's, of course, Ohio State is, they're in the negative because they were only number 5 in the country or whatever they were. So, you have to take it with a grain of salt, right? Because it's basing off the average. But, and then, of course, the worst will not be spoken of. Yeah, my beloved Trojans were the worst among this whole group here. 23 points below their average. So that was suboptimal. Now, one of the other scores, I'll tell you guys can look this up on the computer. I've done various times I've had to do like statistical regression work on stuff. It always comes out that the Wikipedia composite rank that they do, it's like on the front of their page, is like has big statistical significance in regression models on stuff. So I always love this score that Wikipedia does based on all these different factors. So this is looking at kind of like all-time program success over time. And, it's interesting. You see UCLA is right there between Washington and Oregon. So, rough couple of years. But we get this sort of recency bias, right? And we forget that it wasn't that long ago they had 75,000 real people at the Rose Bowl every week.
Yeah, but that was also 1998. So, I guess we have to define recency bias, when you've gone almost 30 years without anything significant other than some second and third tier bowl wins. That's why I'm surprised they are where they are.
And if we could magically take off the last 15 years, Oregon would drop off the map. They are making a mad dash up these lists.
True. That's true. Yeah.
They can thank Kenny Wheaton for that. All right. What about football legacy? So this is national championships. The dark color is since 1960. The light color is pre-1960. So, in case people are wondering about, some of them that have a suspiciously high number. And you see, Oregon's not on there, but you see SC's up there with 9, Washington with 1, UCLA with 1, and then a Heisman at UCLA and 8 Heismans at SC.
I assume you counted Reggie Bush's in there.
Reggie Bush's. I never stopped counting it, but now it's fully official again.
All right.
And then we take a look at all-time winning percentage and total football conference championships, which, you think it's a garbage statistic until you are the reigning conference champions, and then it's like a great statistic. But you can kind of see here, you get those, schools like Oklahoma's got 50 conference championships. Notre Dame right next to them on the list has 0, which of course is funny. But it is interesting to sort of see the winning percentages here. And really how close they are for a lot of these schools is pretty impressive.
Especially when you track it against realignment. Some of them have been in the same place for a long time. You look at Oklahoma, it was the Big 8 for most of Oklahoma's existence, during this time period. And it was, a handful, 2 to 3 competitive teams before the Southwest Conference blew up and Texas went in there, and it changed the conference considerably.
Sorry, I had to blow my nose and I wanted to spare you guys. It is. And when you have fewer, my favorite is how in the years the Pac-10 or the Pac-12 only had 5 schools when it was new in the 50s. They had like 3-way ties for first place.
Yep.
So it all plays a factor in that. An interesting number. All right. So let's look at AP polls. See if there's anything interesting here. So this is AP poll looking at long-term football success. We see here, this is number of weeks ranked at the top or on the left. And on the right is number of weeks ranked at number 1. The story here, we did this with Florida State, is really Florida State and Miami are the fascinating story here. Because they have so few weeks ranked, but so many that are ranked number 1. But, again, sort of nothing too surprising there. Consensus All-Americans, sort of same thing. And then NFL draft, same thing here. We got total draft picks on the left, first round draft picks on the right. You get on all of these, we sort of see we've got, USC is doing its USC thing. Then we got UCLA and Washington often as just like Mark found, often as a pair. And then Oregon, but that's only if you're looking at Oregon all time, because Oregon recently, has been so successful. So go Ducks. And what about on TV? Let's look at TV numbers. Now these are all newer numbers too. So this is this is the football data we're going to look at here, guys, is 2016 to present. And it excludes 2020 because a lot of schools only played half a season. So if we take a look at that, 2016 to present, here's the total Nielsen viewers of regular season games. And one of the things that I think you see here is, the impact of the Pac-12 network in those Pac-12 games. These teams weren't getting in front of enough eyeballs. Also, they had people.
You look at the schools at the top end of the chart, or they're getting the brunt of primetime games, whether that's 3:30 on the East Coast into the primetime hours, whether it's a 12:30 game, whatever the case may be, they're getting the primetime television for good reason. I don't begrudge them that. But then, as you say, you look at getting buried on the Pac-12 network at 7:30 Pacific Coast time.
It makes a huge difference, and it's part of the big reason. You see why they need to make the move. So this takes a look here at regular season game, a number of games picked. Because sometimes these numbers get a little screwy here, right? Because you're talking about Auburn, Alabama, and you're talking about Ohio State, Michigan in front of 20 million people So let's look at number of games picked. So this is interesting. This looks at number of games picked by the OTA networks on the left, so NBC, Fox, CBS, ABC, and on the right it also adds main ESPN to that. So you see, how many times over that since 2016 did the networks choose to pick and say, I want to air your team. And you see they did a lot better here than they did in the total viewers.
Still significant that Washington really got kind of surprisingly shafted in that whole range, because that was during the Quinn Kessenich cupcake era and things like that, where Washington's not scheduling necessarily terrible opponents just like Alabama and any SEC team. But really, I think the combination of that 7:30, 7 o'clock kickoff window and being all the way out in Seattle, I understand living out in Seattle, it's a far stretch for a lot of people that don't live west of Colorado. But it did seem like Washington kind of got, because we're looking at UCLA and Washington both at 28 and UCLA at 46 and Washington at 41 when you go to the right scale. So I think ESPN was certainly one of those that was a casualty of Washington over that stretch.
Well, again, you guys are also, when you think about the history of Washington football, you've got the Jimmy Lake era in that, and all that kind of whole mess. We have some years at USC we would like to forget as well, so I know that feeling well.
One of the things too during this time period, which we're now seeing completely different with the new TV contracts, it was also the system in which the games were picked 2 weeks in advance by the networks. You had that weekly lottery, basically. It's not really what it was, but it's like, all right, this particular week, ESPN has the first pick. ESPN picks whatever game and puts it in its 12:30 East Coast time slot. All right, for the next one, Fox Sports is next. And they would go through until everybody had their time slots filled. And you often wouldn't know when your team was playing until 2 weeks, even a week before the game. That's not the case anymore. If you follow it the way the four of us do, most of the games have been picked by the networks. The networks have filled most of their time slots already.
I love it.
And I do too. And the funny thing is, it shows it could have been happening all along. But I also think it's going to alter the landscape when far in advance when your team is playing and on which network.
Although during the Pete Carroll years, I was living overseas, so I would have to watch USC football on like Armed Forces channel or on like this strange Egyptian bootleg cable we were able to pull. Like it would always be the hard. So I look at this, and no matter when it is, I think it's gravy.
It wasn't worth it. I'm just saying.
So this is average viewership, and this is a really sketchy number. I probably shouldn't even put it in here, but you do. I think this is where I think you see the impact of those night games, particularly for the Pac schools. Just the numbers are lower, and because again, remember, guys, the thing about college football games, and Mark and I've talked because a lot of the data analysis that I've done on this, it's a TV show. It's not a game that's aired for fans. It's a TV show designed for your great Aunt Bessie just as much as it's designed for you. So
look, I mean, look, Lars brought up Pac-12 after dark and those late games, and that's fine. It was kitschy. It was marketing.
It was
hey, we get crazy games, and you got to stay up late, and ESPN the next day would be like, oh, it was crazy times on Pac-12 after dark. But the fact of the matter is it was a bad idea. I mean, were some of the games fun? Sure. If you live on the West Coast, were you watching them? Sure. But as Laura said, if you lived anywhere east of the Rockies, were you watching them? Probably not. And so you were always, it was kitschy marketing, but it wasn't necessarily good marketing, and it wasn't a good strategy.
However, when I was living in DC and in New York, and earlier in the before the everything aired broadcast somehow, how many times did I turn on my TV for the USC game and I got like, welcome to Maryland versus Marshall, and I'd be like, oh, they'd be like, to the rest of the country, you're watching USC UCLA.
Sure.
The one thing I will give that is an amazing thing for fans today is that for fans, every game is watchable, which it never used to be.
Right.
Sorry, we're probably going to so the postseason TV viewership. Washington obviously leads with 2 college football playoff appearances, followed by Oregon and USC, and of course UCLA doesn't really have any big bowl games in that time. Let's look at fans. So this is football attendance. Now, by the way, I corrected it. UCLA lies, and they put down that the Rose Bowl only seats 57,000 people when they fill out their form for the NCAA. That is a lie. So I fixed it.
That's when they put the tarps up in the end zones.
But that's what they actually put on their form to the NCAA. And I was like, oh no, Martin Jarmond, not getting away with that. I'm fixing your data. So you do see here, again, and of course, I mean, the thing is we look at this and we can look at that and say, oh, you look at where USC is, UCLA is, oh, we don't like where we are. That number is significantly higher than the capacity of every stadium in the Big 12, for example, by comparison. So, again, we're looking at the giants of the sport here. But we would all like to climb up a little bit, have that number climb up a little higher, I'm sure. Washington doesn't have much further to climb. Of course, Oregon's capped. Oregon's at 104%. So there's not a lot of room left at Knotson. And then here, if we look at attendance trends, yeah. Sorry.
I wish I were surprised.
The team hasn't been as bad as the attendance would show. So what else is factoring in people stopping their attendance of UCLA football?
I would actually challenge that premise. I think the team was not bad last year. It was,
or the year before,
or the year before. It got better, but I think when you had the first 3 years of the Chip Kelly era where it was horrible,
sure,
and you had a guy who was the face of the program and the head coach who did zero to market the program, who did zero to engage the fan base, who did, you and I have talked about this, so many times, Mark. When I asked Chip at one of the football gaggles before practice, How come we don't see you around some of the other sports the way the other coaches are? And his answer will live with me forever. I go where they tell me to go. I mean, he wasn't out there in the UCLA community marketing. Now, is Deshaun Foster going to be a good head coach? I got no idea. I don't think anybody has any idea. You can like him, you can believe in him, you can do all those things. Do we know if he's going to be a good coach? I had no idea. But the dude is out there. He was out there at the end of the basketball season at the UCLA Arizona game with the students standing in line to get their student seats. And he's out there bringing them donuts in the morning and passing out UCLA football T-shirts. And, he's out there doing stuff, which, look, you're not going to fill the 92,000 seat stadium with UCLA football until you're playing well and playing big name schools. But you can still get 70,000 in there routinely if you engage the fan base. If not, look, it's no different than being in Seattle or being in other places. It's a big city with lots of things to do if you're not winning. And if the team is not engaging, there's plenty of other things to do.
Yeah, and that's what killed him.
Deshaun got nearly 20,000 at the spring game. Now, to most places, that doesn't sound like much. To UCLA, that's epic.
That's huge, isn't it?
Yeah, it's enormous. They used to play it at Drake Stadium, their track stadium, and get 1,000 or 2,000. To get 20,000 at the spring game is massive for UCLA.
Well, that's the same when USC had theirs on TV when Lincoln Riley's first year. It was the biggest I think that the school had ever had.
Sure.
What about basketball fans? Same thing with Washington?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
All right, what about hoops? Not a good couple years for any of these four schools, I'm not going to lie. So this is this is last year's attendance and percent of capacity of attendance. And if you look at trends of attendance relative to the past 10 years, SC is actually up, surprisingly, because USC basketball used to be terrible and now it's depends on the night. It's better. Washington's pretty much unchanged. Oregon's pretty much unchanged. UCLA's down a little bit, but not too much. And let's look at basketball success. So this chart, I think, kind of speaks for itself. It's good to be North Carolina or to be John Wooden. That's my takeaway. What's interesting to me here, though, is that when we think about all of the great athletic powerhouse schools in this group, that are in Mark's Voice of College Football universe here, I was kind of surprised by how few of them have basketball championships. Florida has 2, and they're number 3 on this list. And North Carolina is only there. North Carolina shouldn't even really be on this list. So,
and the Florida national championships were back to back. It was in a very compressed time frame.
Yeah, they had the 2 back to back. Again, Carolina's only on here because Mark gave them a special guest pass to his Voice of College Football universe here for some of the chaos they've got going on right now. But everybody else, it was kind of interesting to see that in basketball. And then basketball success itself. So here we've got same thing we did with football. We did 2002 to this year. We did the same thing with basketball. So the left is the current year, and the right is how you've done, average of everything since 2002. And that gives us, this metric of basketball success. It was a bad year in Westwood. Sorry.
Yeah, it was.
But we've got one more little data point here on the school that I think will give you an interesting thing, and that is national leaders. So how many national leaders went to each of these schools? So this is cabinet officials, including president, vice president, Supreme Court justices, congressmen, and senators. And it's as of March, so it doesn't have the people that quit over the last few weeks. UCLA is number 1 in this group. So we got the logos sort of on top of them there, and you can see obviously the red and blue are who the person is. We gave them a very flexible interpretation as well, but as to how as long as they claim to have attended the school in some capacity, we gave them credit for it.
I'm going to. I don't know who the 2 people in red are for UCLA. And I look, you've got cabinet members and whatever. I'm gonna throw a piece of trivia, useless knowledge out there.
I love that. That's my favorite kind.
That you, Tony, are probably the only person on any of this, including the chat room, that's aware of this. If you go to Pauley Pavilion, the renovated, new, beautiful Pauley Pavilion, there is a gold plaque from the original Pauley Pavilion. They maintained it on the outside of the building, which has the committee that raised the money for the original Pauley Pavilion. And at the top of it is the person who, and remember, this was the mid 1960s, right? So it was before he became a felon. Because the chairman of the fundraising committee later became legendary, notorious, infamous, whatever you want to use. He was not a cabinet official, though, but he was a senior advisor to a president, H.R. Haldeman. Bob Haldeman from the Nixon administration was the chief fundraiser in the mid-60s.
For Pauley Pavilion?
Yep, for the building of Pauley Pavilion.
Well, that's right. Also 65. It was 65 they built it?
Yeah.
That's when Ed Pauley, who was like the man who literally mentored Truman, switched parties essentially.
Yep, Edwin W. Pauley. That's right.
And he went all in for Reagan and walked away. So okay, that would make sense. He's a fascinating guy, by the way.
I'm just trying to figure out the same. No, I'm just trying to figure out the same principle. The 1 is for Washington because I believe you and I believe the numbers. I could not think of who a right-leaning person was in the state of Washington because
some of them are funny, right? So when I put this up on Twitter once and I got all kinds of flack, Jacksonville State Mafia came for me because, Jackson State Mafia came for me because I had not updated the database for Dianne Feinstein's passing away and Senator Butler taking over. And they were like, "Where's our one?" They're like, "We have a senator from California." I was like, "I'm sorry, guys. I'm sorry. It's my fault." So I deservedly took my flack from that. I took my medicine, but so I try to keep it updated, but it was sort of fascinating, seeing, and some of the people are funny, they're people you wouldn't think of, sure. Right? You think Stanford's got Josh Hawley, so and Cory Booker, who was actually on their football team, but you do get some funny folks that came out of these places.
Tony, you can walk away from this conversation feeling good on a high note.
That's right. It's I would be challenged to come up with who most of those people are in that 10, but
hey, it's good they got 10. It is kind of interesting when we think about one of the things that I kind of have wondered about. We know about Charlie Baker and the NCAA's quest for their legislative solution, which they were never going to get. I've been kind of wondering, if the schools were really on board with something, if there was a real thing to fix. I think the schools sort of knew nothing was going to be happening from this. So I've kind of wondered, if the schools were really on board with something, I think the schools themselves have more power than they let on. But I think they use that power for getting huge research grants more than they use it for the NCAA solution.
Yeah, I don't think any school wants to put itself out there by itself unless it's got a whole cadre of other schools speaking up with it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I was gonna say,
Oh.
I don't even think. I mean, Washington, the state of Washington, doesn't even have an NAL bill passed, and it was put on the docket 2 years ago. So Washington would be the school that would push that through, and now they have Pat Chung as the AD. So I would assume Pat could get that through. But then again, I will omit political discussion just because I'm not about to get down there.
I love Pat. Pat Chung is awesome. I was so excited he got that job.
Yeah.
He is. I'm a Wazoo alum, so I was glad that Pat could come over because I knew he had been looking to get out. And I don't want to say looking to get out, but he did what he could at Washington State. And when you look at the amount of money he raised coming over to Washington, my word, this guy can do wonders here.
He's the president of NACTA. I don't know if you guys know this out there. Pat Chung, who's was the Wazoo AD, did a great job at Wazoo, is now at Washington, is president of NACTA, the College Athletic Directors Group. So he's awesome.
Yeah.
Yep.
Much better trade-off than the part-timer or the brief AD that they had previously. And I'm not talking about Jen Cohen.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, I was surprised. I thought it was funny. Dr. Kelsey admitted that they tried to hire Pat Chung the first time, but he was a finalist for Ohio State, and so he couldn't take the interview.
Yeah, Pat always, and I'm not sure if Pat would say this on the record, but without question, Mark could obviously know this, that being an Ohio State guy, being an Ohio State alum, that was an easy job where, hey, if I can get this job, no doubt, 10 out of 10, please go take that. But he wasn't actively looking to leave Washington State at that time. And because that was in the middle of Kirk Schultz and all Wazoo, Oregon State kind of trying to figure out what their next move was. So Pat, in good faith, also couldn't say, hey, I'm going to take this easy parachute at the 10th hour and leave you guys to figure out where you're going to go next with nobody.
It's a crazy business.
Show for another day.
I was so excited when we guys. Mark knows I had Jen on my I put out a list the day that we got rid of the old USC coach, and she was on it. So that's not because of anything inside. It's just because I think she's awesome, and we hired somebody awesome.
Yeah, Jen is a good AD. I will say I'm curious as the amount of Washington hires that USC Athletics has made. And I'm not talking about at the AD level. I'm talking about, look at Quincy Pondexter, Will Conroy. There was a side of Jen where I don't know if apathetic was the right word, but there was kind of a stagnation of sorts where, hey, there's nobody really pushing you to get better, but you're not doing so bad that we need to fire you. And I'm not talking about Jen. I'm talking about Jen didn't need to fire anybody, but at the same point, she wasn't going to be the one to light a fire saying, hey, you guys need to take care of X, Y, and Z. And so I'm loosely seeing what USC is going through on the NIL side, and I'm not surprised given Jen's stance on it, but she's not anti-NIL. She just wants to go about it a certain way.
Yeah, which, by the way, USC is still, don't let people fool you. We are still scarred from what happened with the Reggie Bush mess. USC. It's funny. I read the secret letters in this, or I had the book with had all the info and the secret letters and the secret study they did in the 1950s to figure out how all the it was before the PAC was started, but how every school was cheating. The guy who was essentially the chief of staff at the time for the President Sproul at the University of California did a very secret study to figure out how bad it was at Cal, and exactly what was going on at UCLA and at USC and at Washington and everywhere else. And at Stanford. At Stanford too. Don't let them pretend. Stanford was paying their players with fake or dubious scholarships that gave them sort of the Rhodes Scholarship. It gave them a huge living allowance to their football players, and they were like, "Oh, they're on scholars. They're on academic scholarship." And they were like, Stanford, don't even try. We know.
That takes me back to. Oh yeah, no, that takes me back to when UNC got busted for the paper classes, and Washington was using the same foreign language credit for their football players that UNC was, but nobody mentioned it. And I'm like, yeah, okay, whatever. Not my place to care.
That's
Tony
funny.
Siracusa, everyone. Last word on college football. Please check out Tony's work and the rest of the crew that are so good to us here at the Voice of College Football. Last word on college football. Anything there in particular, Tony, you want to highlight before you need to run?
We are spending some of the summer going through, and it gets complicated because of the transfer portal and the rules that I've set out for my writers, the best returning players by position, by conference. So you get, like, we're wrapping up the Big 12. Who are the best returning players? Now, you can put a footnote for, hey, these great players transferred in. If they transferred from within the conference, we still count them. If they went from, whatever, Texas
I like that
Tech
mentality.
Texas Tech to Kansas, that's fine. They're still a conference returning player. So we started rolling that out last week with the Big 12, and next week we'll be hitting the Big 10, and the best returning players. We'll be including the 4 new schools because they're still returning players. So
we're at 9 days?
Yeah. So
Oh no, it's August 1st.
August 1st. Yeah, that's correct.
Never mind.
So we're having some fun with that. And of course, the preseason watch lists start rolling out pretty soon, and keeping an eye on that kind of stuff. And man, you know what? I mean, I know this gets in the weeds, but for whatever off season I was supposed to have, let's see, I spent all of last Tuesday with the Florida State versus ACC hearing in Leon County, Florida. First week of July, we have the first hearing in ACC versus Clemson in Mecklenburg County. And then the week after that, the first one in Pickens County, South Carolina, with Clemson as the primary litigant. So I'm spending a lot of time in courtrooms and court hearings and things like that, but we're on top of all those details as well. And then in just a few weeks, 4 weeks, we start conference media days already.
Wild.
I hear you. So Tony, thank you so much for being here. We know you need to run.
Yep.
So
Fight on, Tony.
good night.
Thanks, guys. Good seeing y'all. Be well.
Lars, thank you as always for being here, for showing up, giving the Washington perspective on things. Lars joins us on a regular basis, and you can join him on a more regular basis on Locked On Huskies. What's going on there with the Locked On Nation?
Oh man, we're doing a lot of stuff, mostly around recruiting, because there's only so much we can talk about, and Roman and I don't dive too much into the stuff that Tony did today. But I also like people like Tony, who's able to lay out everything on the book side of things and offer it more than just the recruiting side of things. But that's where we're at. We're basically going through, seeing who's going to be some of the top returning guys, throwing out some fun podcasts on Athlon Sports, which I now am the publisher of their Washington site. Go through the roster, look. Thank you. Appreciate that. And I'm also not college football related, but I'm also the publisher of the Seahawks site for them as well. So gearing up for a busy fall covering both football, sports, in Seattle. So
Lars, thank you so much. We'll have to catch up sometime between now and when the Huskies hit the practice field at the beginning of August.
Definitely. I'm trying to get out to Big Ten Media Day, so I'm intrigued by it being in Indianapolis. So I'm attempting a down and back in the same day, maybe in a 24-hour window, because the Seahawks have their first training camp minicamp the following day when I get back.
That'll be fun.
You're a brave man. I used to do those sorts of trips too, but that's in my past. All right, Lars.
I just turned 30 this April, so I only got a few more of those left. So
yeah. Well, have a good one. Thanks for being here, as always. All right, Tony, you did it again.
Well, thank you. It was fun. It is interesting, isn't it, to see how they are, and that goes back to the history of the Pac-12, of the 5 schools. And if we had Stanford and Cal not in football, but in a lot of things, they are all right together. Those 5 schools of USC, UCLA, Stanford, Cal, Washington have been 5 peas in a pod for a century.
And folks in the chat, we know that while we were presenting and focusing on USC, UCLA, Oregon, and Washington in particular, you were eyeing your favorite team, your favorite school, and comparing them. So Tony and I have planned to set up a number of these. We did one a few weeks ago looking at the 4 schools that are most likely the heavy hitters to make their way out of the ACC: Florida State, Miami, Clemson, and North Carolina in particular. And we've got one upcoming Yes, I am expecting the chat to be a little bit more volatile for this one. Ohio State and Michigan.
So should I wear my blue? Everybody in the chat.
You just let me know so I can balance you out. Just
I know.
let me
I probably don't even have any blue. I got to go find some.
But
Let's
Tony,
wear
thank you
big
so
blue.
much. This is awesome.
Thank you, Mark. It was fun. We'll see you
Appreciate
soon.
it.
Thanks,
Feel
everybody.
better.
Thanks.
Tony Altamore, consultant strategist, friend of the show. We appreciate Tony so much. And again, here at the Voice of College Football, our next stop is with Matt and with Tim. And let's see, what time is it right now? We're just about an hour away from the USC call-in show. Again, with Tim and with Matt, 10 o'clock Eastern time, 7 Pacific. It's been a busy day here at the Voice of College Football. Buckeyes live at 11, Clemson live at 5:30, Florida State live at 6, the Big Ten live show right now, USC call-in show coming up directly next. Again, 10 Eastern, 7 Pacific. Head on over to the USC channel. And I've got 10, count them, 10 dark horses for the college football playoff. That video is going to be released tomorrow. And many of you, because I know who you root for, are going to be pleased to be on that list. 10, I mean dark horses. I'm not talking about Tennessee, somebody like that. 10 dark horses for the college football playoff. That video to be released. I am working on both the all-time program rankings. Of course, we did our series looking at each conference a few months ago, but we're going to pull it all together to do a national rankings. So the all-time program rankings. And I'm also working on 2024 program rankings here at the Voice of College Football. So be looking out for that as well. The next time you will see me live will be Monday night. We've got the Texas and the USC shows, but who knows? Depending on breaking news, maybe you'll see me on Saturday and Sunday. We will definitely have other content coming your way. Dependent Fanatic, thank you for your thanks. You as well, Jim. Appreciate you being here at the Voice of College Football. Please hit the like button on the way out. And again, you can hit us up at Venmo, PayPal, and Cash App. Just search Mark Rogers TV. Those links are in the description section as well. In the meantime, folks, a word from our sponsor. And good night. Love what I do as a sports commentator. I have definitely been blessed. I enjoy my career. But I got to say, if I could turn back time, I would learn the business side of sports management. How to manage people, how to manage projects, how to manage situations. And then there's also those times in which you feel stuck in a job, stuck in a career, just feeling that there's a dead end and wondering and waiting, when is that break going to happen? Well, unfortunately, I got to tell you, that break is not coming unless you make it happen. Sports is your passion. You love it, you live it, you breathe it. Why not make your passion your career? Introducing Southern New Hampshire University, our sponsor. At SNHU, you will learn the business side of sports, sports management principles, and how to gather and analyze data. This degree will help you prepare for a career as an athletic director, sports information director, marketing manager, and other exciting roles in the sports industry. You'll be able to tap into SNHU's network of graduates working in sports-related organizations. You'll also have the opportunity to take advantage of an internship or an experiential learning course within the field. Your courses are taught by faculty with real-world experience, so you'll have opportunities to connect with people in the industry. And when you graduate, SNHU will be right there to help you with your job search. SNHU is accredited, nonprofit, and has radically affordable tuition. SNHU was voted one of the country's most innovative universities by U.S. News and World Report. Just go to snhu.edu/VOCFB. The link's also in my description section down below to see if you qualify for SNHU's sports management program. You might be eligible for financial aid or have existing college credits that could fast-track your degree at SNHU. Click the link to get started. Your exciting sports management degree at SNHU awaits you. Do it now.